Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So happy to have you here at TEFAF Afternoons. This is the new series that we have. We've had TEFAF Coffee Talks for 3 fairs. This is the first fair that we've been able to have this room dedicated to the cultural program, and so we're able to have these extra wonderful events in the afternoon. I'm going to take care of one piece of housekeeping I'm always forgetting to tell you, which is this program is live streamed. It will be up on the web immediately and will be archived on our website. So any great morsels or gems of information or knowledge that you are not taking notes about or have forgotten will be online for you immediately after the program. This is a great opportunity and a thrill to have this great panel. We've been working on the concept of this panel for a while, so and it's been a lot of fun and really interesting to have this collaboration. So what I will do quite immediately is just introduce our wonderful moderator, who will then introduce the panel, and we will have time for questions after, so you can start thinking about that now. Our moderator is Megan Kelly, who's art advisor and president of the Association of Professional Art Advisors, and I leave it to you.
Linda, thank you so much. So with both the art and the financial press consumed with writing about the art world in terms of record prices and auction house market shares and the econometrics of specific sectors, it would appear our industry is indistinguishable from any other industry, that it's just a business, that it has everything to do with money and nothing to do with art. Maybe it's just that the press prefers headlines that read, Leonardo sells for $450 million, to a headline that might read, collector buys a painting at TEFAF today that he really liked. So our objective today as a team is to change the conversation back to, or maybe forward to, a focus on art and our passion for it. And there's plenty of work to be passionate about at this TEFAF fair. We're going to talk about what motivates collecting and what length collectors will go to capture the objects of their desire. Who better to help us do that than the 3 panelists that we have with us today? We have a curator, we have a collector, and we have an art advisor, each talking to us from their own vantage point on the process of collecting. Starting to the far right, Anne Temkin, the Marie-Josée and Henry Kravis Chief Curator of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art since 2008, and prior to that, curator there from 2003 to 2008. Marty Eisenberg, contemporary art collector and member of the Committee for Painting and Sculpture and the Drawing Committee at MoMA, and chairman of the board of the School of Curatorial Studies at Bard College. And my friend and colleague Elizabeth Szancer, art advisor and principal of ESK Art and vice president of the Association of Professional Art Advisors. So I want to throw it out to all 3 of you, and I know you've brought some slides of objects that you'd like to talk about. For each of you, the question is, what does passion-driven collecting mean to you in your roles as curator, as collector, and as art advisor? And can you share some examples with us of your pursuit of a particular object of desire? And Marty, if you don't mind, we'll start with you. And I've got your slides up, so tell me when you wish to advance.
Okay, this is in Manhattan, our apartment. And right there is Rob Pruitt, self-portrait, kind of like a game of exquisite corpse, where he just, every cliche that you can think of the contemporary artist, from the Picasso shirt to the Warhol sunglasses to, of course, the beret, and there's a cigarette hanging out of his lips. And then on to Rashid Johnson and a very skinny John Outerbridge hanging there. And a Haley Tompkins is that bucket on the floor. And then we end straight ahead with a Rachel Harrison sculpture. And, I think that in terms of passion, I think that I never really considered it an investment when I first started at all. And I was very, very fortunate. I didn't have a lot of money when I first started collecting. And yeah, I was involved in business, and my aunt was the bookkeeper, and she took $20 a week out of my paycheck and buried it in an account so that I would have money at the end of the year to buy a piece of art. And I would spend all year thinking about how I was going to buy something for like $1,000. And so I really, this is back in the 1980s. And I was very fortunate. I hooked up with a guy, Jack Tilton, who I bought. One of the first pieces of art that I ever bought was from Jack. And it was a drawing for $100. And that was right in my price range, of course. And from there, I befriended him, and he became kind of an advisor, but he never took any money. He was just a friend. And anyone that knows anything about Jack was that he was really a person that knew abstract expressionism stone cold because he had worked for Betty Parsons. And he knew minimalism stone cold because he was a dear friend of Richard Tuttle, who we met through there. He knew folk art because he was from New Hampshire and kind of knew the whole New England folk art thing. And he really knew up to the second contemporary because he would never sit in his gallery. He was always wandering the streets. And so I really learned to really look at art from all different directions, and mostly concerned with young up-and-coming. And again, when you're spending as little money as I was spending, the return on investment was not at all what you were thinking about. And I think that what happens with anything that you're passionate about, it's the people that you encounter, it's the people that you meet that make it the most interesting and the most fun. And from a very early stage, Jack and I met people like Gavin Brown when he was an assistant in a gallery, people like Anton Kern, who was just opening up a gallery. I met Carol Green, who was an assistant at a gallery, and I met a very young guy by the name of Andrew Krebs. And I became friendly with all these people and kind of built my collection amongst friends and people who I established relationships with. So it was always for me about the relationships that I established, and we've kind of carried that over to today. I mean, I mentioned Carol Green, who represents Rachel Harrison. Gavin Brown represents Rob Pruitt. Jack Tilton represents John Outerbridge. I mean, these are all people that we kind of built relationships with. So it was more about the relationships than it was more about the money.
And so when you're in your home and around your collection, I mean, do you feel the presence of those people,
Yeah.
with the art as, so it really is.
It's very important for us that when we hang the work, we put people who really get along well together.
Because otherwise, what a mess in the
Socially,
living
yeah.
room, right?
So because if they come over the house, we want to make sure that they enjoy the place that they're in and they're surrounded by friends, whatever.
That's great. Shall I? This is another grouping from your home.
That's very early Chris O'Feely. It goes to show you when you have great relationships. When I went in to buy that Chris O'Feely at Gavin Brown's gallery, we had already been collecting the works on paper because we're very passionate about works on paper, which, by the way, that's something about passion. People who collect works on paper are passionate.
It's true. People
who don't buy drawings or are not interested in drawings really don't have the picture at all. They really don't quite get it to me. And the Chris O'Feely painting, he had a show at the time, Gavin. I was going to get first pick of his show, but the show with paintings called Captain Shit. And it said right on the canvas, Captain Shit. And I had 3 young kids at the time, and I said, my wife will never let me bring this in the house to show it. And so to make it up for me, he sold me the painting from his own personal collection, which is Sweet Popcorn here. Now, that's relationships, and that's something. How many dealers would really do that for a collector? Take something from their own personal collection. Because it was very easy for Gavin just to say to me at the time, because Chris was really coming on, well, we can sell this to other people. And just had left me, like, if you don't want it, I offered you, and keep going. But Gavin, really, with that kind of relationship, that's how I got Sweet Popcorn, which is a great painting. And that, of course, the dining room in the house, and straight ahead is Charlene Von Heil with Monica Baer and Rebecca Quaitman, dead center there. And you see, when you're, again, as a collector, you can hang things, and it doesn't have to be brilliant in any way in terms of, in terms of the narratives or the way they fit in conceptually. Here, they just look good because they're all black and white. So you can do a wall that's just black and white and not have to explain it any more than that. But on the other side, it is all female abstraction. And we've always pursued female artists. You know, that was something that, from the time we started buying through Jack, Marlene Dumas, we began to really build a collection. And Kiki Smith also, who I bought through Jack, we started out with female artists who we felt were very undervalued, and undervalued in terms of the history, not so much in terms of the money. Drawing is the point that I made. Collecting works on paper. So we built these shelves so we can just stack the drawings on the shelf and flip them. The great thing about drawings is, of course, you can carry them around with you. You can lay them on the floor. You can fit them in your car. You can transport them easily, okay? They're durable because of the glass in front of them. You don't have to worry about it. They're just the greatest thing to collect is drawing, I think. And it's really the artist's hand. And so we're always constantly flipping drawings out, changing them. And you could see, for instance, there's two artists there who are, that's William Scott and Helen Ray, artists with disabilities that work in centers for artists with disabilities, which is another passion of ours that we collect and supporting those people. And then also right alongside of Kai Althoff, in the middle there, that's a Martin Ramirez, an example of one of the great folk artists of all time. And then that Amy Winehouse is by Rachel Harrison. But it's mixing and juxtaposing all these different things to create energy within the collection and create a collection that's unpredictable.
I can say one thing from having the pleasure and honor of having Marty on our acquisitions committee, as you said, for the painting and sculpture department, but also in the drawings and prints department. I think the first thing I would say about you is you are fearless. You are fearless to take a stab at something that you almost know nothing about and support it, because looking at it, you know it's great. You don't need to hear or read or whatever the credentials were in order to have a negative reaction, same thing. Are you fearless like that in everything?
I'm very impulsive. Okay, I'm very, very impulsive, and that's what I will tell you. Yeah. So if that's fearless, it could be stupid, by the way, as part of it also, by the way. You know, but I jump, and I'm very expressionistic, and I like art that's expressionistic also, by the way. Yeah.
But is that something, you know, what Anne is describing, that response that you have when you first see something, is that something that you always had when you started buying things, or is that something that grew with confidence and with these relationships with dealers?
Malcolm Gladwell spoke about that too, right? The gut instinct.
Yeah.
I think in his last book, that is usually correct, he said. So I've been usually correct, in other words, you know, in that sense of just being very impulsive and grabbing it. So I think that it's worked well for us in that sense.
And so that initial passion lasts,
yes,
for the most part.
Yeah, listen, I never bought a piece I regretted, okay, ever.
Good.
My regrets are what I didn't buy.
You want to tell us about the one that got away?
Oh, there's a million of them, but that's not important. But the honest to God truth is, the stuff where artists that never went anywhere, like artists that we collected and nothing ever turned out for them, it's because everyone else was wrong, not us. Yeah, no question. It's that we know for sure, everyone that I knew, that this was the right thing, and whether it was Jack and I, or Gavin or I, or Anton, this is terrific. We know it's good, and curators, who I'm always talking to at MoMA, we all know it's good, and the fact that that artist never went anywhere, that's everyone else's problem. You know, is the way we always looked at it. Yeah. You know?
It's not a just world.
Right.
Right.
Exactly, yeah.
But the other thing, talking about the acquisition committee meetings, that I want to add here is that whereas you're involved all the time for yourself with brand new things by people who you've either been following or new things by people who you haven't ever even come across before, you're very plugged in to art from 100 or 50 years ago. Yeah. And you have a strong point of, believe it or not, he has a strong point of view on those things as well. And what I'm wondering is how much you think your take on older art comes from the art you live with, or...
I hope that what we're doing in terms of new contemporary, I hope that this is my way of trying to replace fill in the void in my life that I never got a chance to buy a Sheila or a Klimt or a Monet or a Gauguin. I couldn't, so I try to buy what I think is the next best thing, right. Something that's going to hold up. You work with Ronald Lauder, who got to buy so many of these things that just really blow my mind. And by the way, that's a great guy to work with on a committee. There was no one ever that you ever sat on a committee with like Ronald Lauder. Yeah, I mean, he was absolutely a true connoisseur. He absolutely is a true connoisseur and an amazing person. And so this must be a fascinating thing that you're doing, because you get to go back in time. And I guess that he dabbles. Does he dabble at all anymore up to the minute at this point?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes. It's not totally off the table, but not with the focus that he had in the past in terms of contemporary art when he was buying post-war, German and American art from time to time. He still does look at contemporary art. He purchased contemporary art. He looks at contemporary art a lot. He still looks at it. He may not buy it, but he looks a lot at it. And I think you've made a very good point. I think so many people say, well, I can't collect art. I can't be in the range of a Ronald Lauder. I can't buy that Sheila. But you've made a really good point about the fact that that's not what it has to be about. There's so many ways that one can be passionate about collecting, and so many ways to do it. And I think that you kind of share something with Ronald in explaining being impulsive and reacting from the gut, because I think he does that very often. He doesn't need a whole academic rendition of why this work is good and how it fits in, and he doesn't want to even read about all that. He just knows it's really good. So I think it's interesting. I think there's a similarity.
So can we talk a little bit about the work that you do with your clients and how, as an advisor, you help them pursue their passions? And does your passion come in at all, or do you try to hold back on that?
Well, no, I do think I'm very passionate, and I also cannot collect on the level of Ronald Lauder. But I think that, working with someone like him or with any collector, and we work with a number of collections, that you have to work really in tandem with the collector. You have to understand the collector's interests, the collector's passions, the collector's goals, and really set those goals and have a focus. I think that's really important. And keep having that conversation about that focus, as you continue in time, to keep things on track and see where we're at. The slides that I prepared for today, just a couple of examples I thought could explain what drives a passionate collector, and to what degree will this collector really go to get what he wants. So being that the TEFAF fair combines all kinds of art between spring and fall and so on, I thought it might be interesting to show something that was done in 1305, so going really back in time. And I'm talking specifically about this gold ground painting on the left panel, which is by an artist, Giovanni da Rimini, done in 1305. It's an artist who had looked at Giotto and painted this panel of scenes from the life of the Virgin. This panel came up at auction in July of 2014 at Sotheby's in London. And Ronald Lauder was determined to be the purchaser of this magnificent panel. I mean, this image doesn't do it justice. It's just a reference. Anyway, he was a successful bidder, and that was great. But now what? It had come from a very, very important collection. Originally, it was in the Barberini collection in Italy, and then with the Duke of Northumberland at Alnwick Castle, and now it was being sold. Well, what were the chances that an export license would be granted? We took a chance on that, and we waited. And there's another case about a collector who paid for something before getting an export license. So talk about how do you work with a passionate collector. You have to do your own due diligence as an advisor, and you really have to understand a lot more than just, is this a beautiful picture? You have to understand, sometimes it's not even that interesting, but the business side of things, the financial side, the legal side, and how all these things come together. Anyway, we waited and went through a first round of the commission in the British Council, and no one came forward to block the picture. So we thought, this is looking good. But about in the next year, someone did come forward. It was the National Gallery in London. Came forward and said, you know what, we want to block that picture. That picture should come to us. It should not leave the UK. Now what? But they didn't have the funds for it. They were really sure they would be able to raise the funds. Would not be a problem. Well, this did not sit well with Ronald Lauder. He said, what am I going to do? And as those of you who know him, he's extremely creative in his thinking. And he said, I'm going to come up with something. So we invited the then director of the National Gallery, Nicholas Penny, to come to New York for a meeting, and we said, why don't you bring along your chief conservator? So we sat in a particular room in a residence where Ronald Lauder envisioned this painting. And we sat there for the meeting, and he said, I have an idea. What if I provided the funds for the picture? I don't need to own the picture, but I need to look at that picture every day because I'm that passionate about the picture. I don't have to own it, but I want to have it. So what can we do to work together? Anyway, a long discourse ensued. Meetings in London with their council, Lauder's council, and so on and so forth. And we came up with a structure, and it worked. So Ronald Lauder provided the funds to the National Gallery so that they could buy the picture, with the proviso that he had a lifetime loan of this work. And it was very important for him to do that. And part of the structure is that it does return to the UK, to the National Gallery, every few years. And in 2017, it did go back to go on loan to the National Gallery with its probably pendant panel. The pendant panel on the right shows scenes from the life of Christ. And that hangs in Rome at the Antiquities Museum there. And so first the exhibition was in London, and then it went to Rome, and now it's back on the wall in New York, the one on the left, and the other panel belongs to Rome. So the reason why I wanted to talk about this is that, first of all, I'd love to talk about a lot of things which I cannot tell you about, but this became public. And there was a press release from the National Gallery that was approved that said that this the panel was purchased with the very generous donation from such an American philanthropist. with his name. So I was able to share this with you today. But I think it's a perfect example of what lengths a collector will go to ensure that his passion is met with having something in front of him, and he looks at this every day and just loves it. Now, what we have to do is every month send condition reports. We have to take readings. The whole room had to be adjusted for climate control. The windows were changed. I mean, we had to go to great lengths to make this happen, but it happened, and it's fantastic.
A wild story. But it also makes me think, so Ronald Lauder, who for many years really focused on modern art to spectacular effect, over the last number of years has become very interested in this very early gold panel painting from the Renaissance. And what I think about that is that it's sort of full circle to Marty Eisenberg's interest in the very brand new. Because at a certain point for Ronald, I think, doing modern art, there just wasn't enough great things out there left for him. But also his mind was too amazing and his creativity too big to just say, you know, I'll wait for this material that I know so well to come along. And instead of going forward in time, for him going back 6 centuries is maybe a little bit the same as you going around and seeing what's brand new, because it's not that all of these things are kind of known inside and out. In fact, there's the whole other issue, which you don't have to deal with, of fakes, right? I mean, enormous amount of risk in terms of something, even what it's supposed to be. But it's also like for people who are just used to such oversaturation with 20th or 21st century art in the marketplace, talked about by academics, in exhibitions everywhere. This is as much of a discovery, really, as I think the way you do it. I think
So
it's interesting. Both of
in a
you
way
want to
of-
get out from the predictable or what anybody who can read a book would know to do.
So, I mean, a certain eclecticism maybe keeps that passion and that interest alive, to be able to, you know, move between periods or to see relationships between periods, and keep yourself interested and excited. That's your next slide.
Well, this speaks to, in terms of being eclectic. This is an image from the Neue Galerie, from the exhibition that I curated with Ronald Lauder on selections from his collection, going back from 3rd century BC to contemporary art through the centuries, because his collection really does span the centuries. And I didn't bring, 100 slides from this exhibition, but I just wanted to show you, I mean, he also is a foremost collector of arms and armor, mostly European 16th century. But here, combined with paintings by Cézanne. So just as an example that collectors can do many different things and can be inspired by various periods of history, and they can be combined very successfully. Don't have to be stuck in any one place at all. And I think a true passionate collector is not.
And as an advisor, are you bringing things to him as much as he is coming to you and saying, I want this now, I want to move in this direction, I want to think about these things? Like, who's driving the bus, or do you take turns driving that bus?
I think it's really a combination. I think it's a constant back and forth every day. This is every day. It's really every day of the week. Something is discussed. I remember when we did this exhibition and a reporter called and said, well, we'd like to know, so how many works of art does Ronald Lauder buy a year? And I said to him, well, we never answer those questions. He said, no, I have the answer for you. Why don't you tell them it's about 200, but it was a slow year. So, so it's really something we discuss every day. We both look at auction catalogs, and offers come in so many different ways. So they come through just looking at auction catalogs, private sales, dealers, artists, galleries, museum conversations, every which way. So it's ongoing. So it's really hard to say where one begins at this point and the next one starts. It's at this point.
And do you ever have to sort of hold him back or say, I've assessed this and no?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Well, one thing that you alluded to, Anne, was about authenticity and so many fakes on the market, but also an issue, tremendous issue, because of what we do as provenance. And sometimes there are issues, and we have to stay away. And if anything like that comes up, he does stay away.
That's your role.
That's our role to research all that.
I have a question for you, Anne. So in other words, here you are at MoMA, right? And you're trying to build a collection. I'm in the room, for these acquisition meetings. In other words, like between filling holes and what's new, in other words, how do you really prioritize, in other words? And for you yourself, what are you interested in right now? Like some of the things that can you share that with us? Some things that you're really interested in right now for the museum?
Yeah, so MoMA has had a double track really since we were founded. And I'm fortunate because I'm personally interested in that double track. I'm not one or the other. The one track is buying the Klimt, and the other track, so it's like we're Ronald Lauder and Marty Eisenberg both, right? Which is why we need you both on our acquisition committees. And it's a completely schizophrenic existence because there isn't like an A collection and a B collection, or the storage for the Van Goghs and the Rothkos and the storage for the Rachel Harrisons and the Rob Pruitts. It's like they all have catalog numbers that are completely undistinguishable. So every brand new thing by somebody who you've never heard of, who enters the collection, enters it by the exact same route and the exact same procedures that when we're occasionally lucky enough to buy some really major historic piece from 100 years ago, enters. And you have to kind of be a split personality, which I am. So that's good. And what I would say about the passion thing for us is, and my advice to other museum people, I think, is to be more like Ronald and you ourselves. I think there is this perception out there that we have our list of gaps. Gaps is like the word. Well, no, the $5 word for it is lacunae, right? There are lacunae of this, this, and this. And it's kind of an obsolete point of view, because that's a point of view where you had a canon, and the canon was pick 10 or 100 or 1,000 things, and you could say, oh, on that list of 1,000, well, we're up to 886. But today we don't think in those terms. We think of much more elastic terms. So really, we're putting new things in a so-called canon every year. And we are aware that a canon is sort of like this living, breathing thing that changes over the decades. The canon from 20 years ago isn't the canon, so-called, from 50 years ago anyhow. So it's kind of a fiction. So really, what's the right answer? The right answer for the early stuff and for the brand new stuff is to put on my Marty or my Ronald hat, and whom I both resemble so closely, and just be, does this make me, does this give me a lump in my throat? Does this make me not care about anything logical, like if the National Gallery is buying it all, has the right to buy it instead of me, or it doesn't fit in my building, or I already have 50 of them, or whatever. The museum's going to be better off if that's how we operate, not with our minds. Because our minds are good. We know our minds are good, and our minds are kind of taking care of what they need to take care of. But
it's that same feeling that Marty was describing, that sort of Malcolm Gladwell experience when you're standing before something that helps you to decide.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a gut
It has to
feeling.
be there, yeah.
You know, I like that idea of the Ronald Lauder and I in the same room and all. And I have to tell you, I really miss him. He used to really come to meetings a lot, Ronald, okay? And the meetings that were the best were always drawing. I hate to say this to you.
I can
but,
take it.
But the drawing committee was the most passionate group of collectors, okay?
He truly loves drawing.
Oh, he loves drawing, Ronald, and I'm going back. I was lucky. I got involved with the drawing committee I must have been 15 years ago or so, when bringing in a drawing by Kai Althoff, it would just make it by the skin of its teeth, you know, because people would argue against it, and you had to fight to get a Chris O'Feely drawing into MoMA. I mean, you know, and so Ronald, of course, was always leading the charge, and of course, his great line, Ronald, was, he'd take a look at something, a new contemporary piece, and he'd go, "Who do you think we are, the Tallahassee Museum of Art?" He goes, "This is the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and that should have no place in this museum." And I would start going at it with him, of course, and you know, and we would really have it out in a lot of meetings, and you know,
But even without the absence of Ronald, don't you think that's just part of our time now, that people don't criticize and scorn and ridicule art? Like, when do you read a negative review in the newspaper or a magazine that this show was lousy or that this artist really should get a different job?
You know,
and you really miss that.
You know, what happened is, in the day when the people would argue so vigorously against the artist that, for instance, I wanted to bring in, okay? And all, I would go home, I wish it would just turn around. But now that it's turned around, and now that everything gets in and no one puts up a fight anymore, it's not fun anymore. Like, you know, the fun is, the battles have gotten out of it. You know, so be careful what you wish for, is like the lesson. So I said to Ronald, I said, "Ronald, how come you don't show up anymore?" I said, "I'm looking for a good fight again, you know?" I said, "Ronald, where have you been?" And he says to me, he goes, "Oh, it's too politically correct now." He says it's too easy. It's like everyone just collapses and folds too easily.
So what about with the curators, Anne, you and your colleagues? Before you go to collection committee meetings, are there some juicy battles?
Right. I mean, you know, one interpretation of what Marty's describing is the curators are so fantastic right now that everything we bring you is brilliant. But I don't think that's the explanation. I think it is the explanation that has affected the market overall, which is art is great. And, you know, why start choosing sides or defending something else against another, because we don't have something like we did 50 years ago or 100 years ago, that this is right, that this is what art should be, and these other things aren't that, so they're not good art. And at this present moment in history, just because of whatever historical circumstances, there isn't the this against which everything else can be measured, which made it easier, I think, for people to object. And today, if they're going to object to something, they have to find within themselves, just as you have a gut feeling pro, you have to have a gut feeling anti. And that's hard. That's hard to
So even
produce.
though there isn't this single canon by which to measure things and to have that argument, is there a place for connoisseurship? Especially, I would ask that of, you know, in terms of, you know, emerging in contemporary art, or does it not really exist?
Oh no, I mean, working in a museum, that's the first thing you learn. That whether you're talking about Matisse, or whether you're talking about a creative growth artist, the institution in California that Marty supports so splendidly with disabled artists, you know, they have good ones and they have less good ones that they make on a given week or a given year or a given decade. And it's Marty's job and Elizabeth's job, as well as my job, to know that the work that you pick is the one that, when there are retrospectives of that artist, they're going to want to borrow yours. And when the people who come to the museum want to remember a certain thing, yours will be the one they remember by that artist, because give it a little time, and there's just absolute clarity if you work in a museum that some things on their own terms always are better than others within a given artist's oeuvre. So it would be of no use to the museum if I liked Klimt, pretend it's 100 years ago, if I liked Klimt and so I bought a Klimt. No, I have to buy the greatest Klimt, which hopefully with my training and my my experience, I know the difference between the one and the other. And I think that's a really overlooked thing today, because it's a little bit of an elitist thing to say this one, even within a given artist or a given group of artists, this is the exact one you want. But no matter how out of fashion that way of thinking is, if you work in a museum, you know it's true, right? And if you live with the work at home, you know it's true. Certain work goes on being strong and articulate and moving and generating energy in your own self every time you look at it with some attention. And then other work just doesn't do it as well. Mm-hmm. It's not like something is literally better made or bigger, but it's just got the sparkle of greatness. And I think that's all of our jobs
And
to
what's
to
the
know.
biggest challenge to find those great things? Or do you find that because of the positions that you're in as collectors and as curators that you're getting access to those best things?
Well, I get access to the best things only from the galleries that we've supported.
Got it.
Through our lives. In other words, when we first started out, we were buying from the same galleries over and over again to ensure ourselves that we would get the best things. But there are many artists that we never collected and never bought because we never had access to those galleries. And I only buy primary market, by the way. We never buy anything at auction. So we only buy, and our attitude was always, we would buy early, and if we missed it, we would not go back. In other words, either we bought in right at the beginning and we did it, but if we missed, and we missed Richard Prince and we missed Jeff Koons, we didn't see it coming, or this and that, but we would never go back. That was like part of our philosophy. But then again, the galleries that showed those people, we weren't really involved with. So we were never really offered, So it kind of worked out well that the galleries that we worked with would offer us great things.
But one of the things that really could happen at the museum, I think, and doesn't often enough happen at acquisition committee meetings, is you don't ask us to defend why this exact drawing or why this exact sculpture is the one by that person for MoMA, right? That would be interesting conversation.
Well, that's come up. But not enough, maybe. Yeah. One of the most exciting things, by the way, is this piece that's up there. I think that this is a spectacular piece, and I think this is someone that's worth, because I had no idea who this person was when it entered the room. I was taken by its beauty, but this is something. Tell us the story, because I think that most people in the room wouldn't recognize Paula Modersohn-Becker. But tell us who this is.
So this is obviously a slide stacked because of the population here. This is a work that Elizabeth Szancer was in on with us during the acquisition process. But Paula Modersohn-Becker is an artist from the first decade of the 20th century whom we owned nothing by. And the idea for putting her into the collection is a product of this it's really last 40 years, but very intensively last decade of saying who are the great women artists who art history left out, not because their work wasn't fantastic, but because they were female and there was this implicit or unquestioned sexism going on. And so this is an example where most of her work actually is in museums. And so it wasn't like we could go out shopping for a Paula Modersohn-Becker. But luckily for us, there is a Paula Modersohn-Becker Foundation in Germany, and we got to know an author of the main monograph on her, and she introduced us to the people at the foundation. And they said, okay, let's think of all of the Paula Modersohn-Beckers in private collections who might be willing to part with them with theirs. And we made it harder because, of course, we said, no, not just any Paula Modersohn-Becker. We want a self-portrait by Paula Modersohn-Becker because she was, in her very short career, she died at 31, a great maker of self-portraits. She was the first, we think, artist to paint herself naked, and she was also the first artist to paint herself pregnant, which you can tell that she is here. And so this is painted a couple of years after Matisse and Picasso kind of came to the forefront in brand new 20th century Paris. She went off into Paris, had long stays in Paris from her little town in Germany. And you can see that she learned so much about painting from that Fauve moment or the Picasso moment of using masks. But she went home and did something very distinctive. But we said, okay, we want something from that last couple of years of her life, 1904, 1905, 1906. We want it to be of her. And that narrowed it down to a number of works that you couldn't even count, that wouldn't even add up to a handful. But the foundation did go to one of the families that owned one, and it was this one. And they spoke to them about a museum wanting it. And they had an issue because this too was a painting that had belonged formerly to a Jewish family from which had to sell it. So that all had to get worked out between the current owner and the prior family who owned it. So this, I think I put this slide here not only because it's a Lauder story too, but because this was a 2-year process. Because from going to the Stiftung, getting them to identify a work that would be what we wanted, overcoming the problems internally with the current owners, and getting it here, it was, and 2 years it's often even longer. You probably don't have that as much in your situation, but.
No, but only MoMA could do this, of course, right? One of the only museums in the world that could put that together. I'm also on the acquisition committee at the Studio Museum of Harlem, and we're trying to figure out how we come up with the money to frame the piece.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So I go from that acquisition committee sometimes in the same week to this.
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's remarkable. At MoMA, everything's possible. In other words, there's nothing that if Anne really wants it, it's going to happen, which is a really remarkable thing.
I agree. I agree.
It is a remarkable thing. No, and that's,
I know when
thanks.
Ann calls, it's for a good reason.
So this ended up with an incredibly happy ending. It's now in the gallery just beyond where the Demoiselle d'Avignon is, and you stand in the middle of the gallery, you look at her, you look at the Demoiselle d'Avignon from, a few months apart from each other, just two completely different views of women, among other things at the beginning of the century. And with single moves like that, right? Your whole presentation of the beginning of 20th century art is shifted. And the kind of partnership with a trustee, the kind of partnership with the scholar on the work, the kind of partnership with the people on the committee who get why you're doing it and want to support that, it's beyond imagination.
I can't wait to see it up now.
Yeah.
Me too. I haven't been to- But, I think it speaks to a point, Marty, that you made right at the beginning of this talk and what Anne is saying, that so much of successful collecting really depends on relationships. There's no question. It's really about the people involved. Yes, it's great art, but without the dedicated people, the passionate people, the scholars that you can go to and count on, you have to have those relationships, really makes such a difference.
That's true.
It's
No,
part of
even-
the success story.
Even like in this case, the head of the Modersohn Becker Stiftung, I think even without me knowing it, made multiple visits to the family to say, you know, you're going to be able to work this out. We're going to get to the bottom of this. And yeah, what was in it for him, you know, except his pride that this painting would end up being finally
Right. I mean, the right
in the
thing
US.
for the museum, the right thing for the artist.
Yeah.
Hopefully the right thing for that painting, too.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I wonder if at this point the audience has any questions for the panelists.
Everyone wants to know what Marty's buying next.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks for the insights. Quick question. I see more and more collectors sort of gravitate, contemporary art collectors are gravitating toward also looking some old masters. And, you know, price points is one attraction, you know, rarity of work is another attraction. And also, you know, some people feel that it's really, you know, they want to give more eclectic look to their collection or more eclectic depths. Do you see this as a trend, and what advice would you give to those collectors who are sort of trying to extend the contemporary art collection with the old masters?
Sure. I mean, if they want to, that's great. I think that there is something to be said for knowing a bit about what you're doing. But no reason not to. I think there are kind of two kinds of people. There are super deep people who want to just burrow into some very narrow territory, and then there are some that are really broad, and one century isn't enough, or one medium isn't enough, and I certainly can't say that one way's better than the other. But you have to be a buyer beware, right, when you're into territory that isn't familiar to you. I don't see that, what would I say, there would be any good reason to tell someone not to go in any direction, as long as they want to. That gets back to the gut thing. I mean, that's the interesting point, right? Like, as an advisor, in a sense, what you have to do is tell the client you're working with to follow their gut, not to crush their gut. I mean, not everyone has Marty's gut or Ronald Lauder's gut, but...
Yeah, you do have to work very closely with someone, and you don't want to ever crush it, but you ought to go about it the right way. And I think certainly in a field like Old Masters or something that requires a little more in-depth knowledge, there's no substitute for sort of education and experience. And if you don't have it, it's important to know what you don't know and to go to the people who do know, who can be helpful, because I agree, it's buyer beware.
Yeah, right. I mean, as all of you guys were...
And you know, you know, Max, what you see is the contemporary galleries are going back in time, right?
Right.
And they're trying to dig up people from the past to add to the stable collection. Of course, as we know, a lot of those people have been forgotten from the past, and they deserve to be forgotten. And they and they shouldn't be resuscitated. You know, they shouldn't be resuscitating that patient, so to speak. You know. And so I think that's a part of it. For us, for Rebecca and I, we are going back a little bit. Even though we don't do it in contemporary, we're buying, we like outsider or folk art, whatever the term is. You know, we juxtapose some of that within the collection just because it brings a certain kind of energy to it. And we find that fun.
So just sort of accessing that same team of information when you do, you know, broaden out to a separate field.
That's your old
Yeah.
masters.
Right. Yeah. Oops. She's coming with a microphone. Yeah.
Thank you. If I'm not mistaken, I saw a Becker exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in Paris about 2 years ago, which was wonderful and which opened my eyes to this extraordinary artist. What I wanted to ask you is, despite the fact that the art market is, quote, global, is there a different approach towards putting together art exhibitions in Europe versus the United States? Is there a different zeitgeist between the two, London, Paris, or New York? Or you're sort of all trying to find artists like this and put them on the map?
I would say that it wouldn't be a geographic distinction. It would be personal or institutional distinctions. So even within America or within a certain country in Europe, you'll have different institutions going about things differently because of the people within them. And there are certain global things taking over, like everyone is interested in women artists right now because suddenly it just seems really bizarre that as little as 15 or 10 years ago, we wouldn't have questioned that our exhibition schedule was whatever, 5-to-1 men to women or something like that. So that's something that I think is common. But I couldn't make generalizations about ways of curating that are geographic. I think it's personal. I mean, like, for example, you could say, oh, because European museums are, for the most part, government institutions, and American ones are, for the most part, private institutions. Does it bring a difference? I don't think so, because it's about the people.
Hi. Anne, I was wondering, in terms of the Museum of Modern Art, when you come across an emerging artist, is there a particular process or amount of time that you look at the work and decide that you want it in the collection, or how does that work? Just curious.
So we try to be pretty impulsive. Our impulsive is probably Marty's, like, long and intense deliberation, but we'll very rarely buy something out of somebody's first show, I think. We usually would say we want to see a second or a third show, but then we remind ourselves that, you know, Alfred Barr went to Klaus Oldenburg's store and bought the double cheeseburgers, you know, smack like that, or on and on and on. And we try to be less cautious than our reasonable feelings might make us be, but that's super gut level, you know, and we don't do it often. We feel like, thank God, we can rely on people like our trustees and our acquisition committee members to be out there before we are, and then we come groveling to them saying, you know, oh wow, you knew to buy that back then, would you give it to us? And that's really a very big aspect of the partnership.
I think that being on the committee, I'm with Anne. Anne's thinking is right. In other words, there are times when I'll say, like, Ronald, we're not the Tallahassee Museum of Art here. And this person with only one show doesn't deserve to be in MoMA yet. I think even someone like myself, it's okay for me to, obviously, I buy first show all the time, but I'm saying, but the museum should be waiting more for the most part. It's just rare, right? I mean, you know, Cameron Rowland was recent, right? That be an example where you just said that this is something that is that important. But for the most part, I agree that it's, for MoMA, that's not really the right thing to be doing.
Yeah, it's just a different process. Yeah. Thank you all for amazing insights, Anne and Marty and Elizabeth. Thank you all for coming.